Well, good evening, everybody. William Warfield here with you once again as we do another edition of the PrepSpin podcast here tonight. And tonight we're going to talk with Bluegrass Orthopedics, also with medical doctor. He is Tad Seifert as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about concussions tonight. Andrew Carlson joining us here on the show as well. And gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and bring you in. Fellas, how you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Doing good. Doing good. And Andrew, how you doing, man?
Can't complain, William. We're healthy, and I think we're all at home right now. so
Yeah.
Oh,
Yep, we are. So, Andrew, I know you want to introduce Tad to us
yes,
and tell us about, all about Tad, because I understand from reading about him, he's pretty well known in the concussion world.
well, Dr. Seifert's been a friend of mine for quite a while, and I'll just do a quick intro for you. But he's a graduate of the University of Oklahoma College of Medicine, which he will definitely make sure you know. He completed his internal medicine internship at University of Louisville and has a residency in neurology at the University of Texas, Houston. He then completed a fellowship in headache and facial pain at the renowned Houston Headache Clinic. And his definitely specialty is concussion and headaches. He currently serves as the director of Norton's Healthcare Sports Neurology Program in Louisville. Folks from all around the country, all around the state, can find him there. I know he when he contacts us athletic trainers, the reach is definitely more than just the Louisville metropolitan area. Dr. Seifert is currently the team neurologist for the University of Louisville, Bellarmine, Indiana University Southeast, and Spalding University. He also serves as an unaffiliated neurotrauma consultant to the NFL's Cleveland Browns as well as NASCAR. He's the former chairman of the Kentucky Boxing and Wrestling Commission's Medical Advisory Panel, which is really unique, and I hope he talks a little bit more about that tonight. He's also a former NCAA Headache Task Force. He's a current member of the National Headache Foundation, or board member of that foundation. And his research interests include post-traumatic headache, as I mentioned, but also combat sports, and I'm sure we'll dive into that a little bit today.
Wow.
So, Dr. Seifert, thanks for coming on. I greatly appreciate it.
thanks, Andrew. It's good to see you again, and William, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Doc,
Awesome.
yeah, welcome to the show, and we're lucky to have you here tonight. It's a hot topic each and every year, especially this time of season. This time of year anyway, with football getting ready to start back. We hope anyway that it's getting ready to start. This year is kind of unique because we don't know when it's going to start, but generally around this time of year we start talking about concussions and what exactly, Doc, is a concussion? What can you tell us about that?
No, that's a good question. So, really, at the end of the day, a concussion is when you have any sort of sudden acceleration or deceleration of the head and neck, to be precise. The brain is within the skull, that bony cavity in the head. And anytime you have a sudden, whiplash-like motion of the head and neck, the brain subsequently shakes inside the skull cavity. And it's that sudden shaking activity or shaking motion that then causes the injury of concussion. It's really more of an injury of, functional issues rather than any sort of structural abnormality, meaning if you get a fairly standard, brain scan like a CAT scan or an MRI, in the majority of patients with concussion, it's going to look fine. It's really more of an injury at the cellular level, which we have to diagnose clinically.
Yeah, we hear a lot
Doc, you
about it.
mentioned neck.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh,
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
William. Well, he mentioned a pretty important thing there about the head and neck. And I know in sports, a lot of football coaches understand the importance of neck and neck strength and neck mobility. But maybe you can speak to how many concussions you see that may not necessarily revolve around getting a hit to the head, but just that acceleration and the lack of either the lack of ability to absorb the energy through a rotation or through that acceleration. But I think people also need to understand it definitely is not just a head contact; it's also the neck.
Now, that's a good point, and a couple examples that I can think of that. Back when Michael Vick was still playing in the NFL, later in his career, he had an injury where he had scrambled out of the pocket and was caught on the run by a defensive end, and he was caught in the grasp, of the defensive end, and kind of swung around in a circle down to the ground. And when you really watch the replay, his head never hit the turf, but he had that sudden kind of jerking of the head and neck. And at the end of the day, he was diagnosed with a concussion that was thought to have been sustained on that play. And again, going back and looking at the film, he never had any true head trauma, but yet he did have that sudden, acceleration, deceleration of the head and neck. So it can happen without any sort of actual direct blow to the head. We also see a lot in motorsports, in NASCAR, for example, where these drivers have these sudden impacts, whether it's against another car or against the wall or what have you. And when you go back and look at the film, they never truly have any direct head trauma, but yet they still have that sudden motion of the head and neck that causes that sudden brain movement.
Yeah, and we had talked earlier in the introduction. Andrew had mentioned that you were doing stuff with combat sports as well. So on the Kentucky boxing board, I believe, and then also I believe in UFC a little bit too, right?
A little bit, yeah. In fact, combat sports was really one of my first, delving into the world of concussion. And I just, luckily, through a number of circumstances, ended up being somebody that knew somebody that needed coverage for a combat sports event. So I ended up serving as a ringside physician for a few events, and that's how I segued into my involvement ultimately with the state boxing commission. And that really just grew into a love of the sport itself, which I know is a bit of a paradox, being a brain specialist having an interest in a sport where arguably the goal is to concuss your opponent. But yet, I do think there is a role for physicians like myself to try to help those athletes and to try to help make a sport that's inherently unsafe, at least a little bit safer.
Yeah.
Now, I think we saw UFC had a contest recently in Florida, at least multiple contests. I think you tweeted out about one of them. I think I saw a picture of the individual, and he didn't look so hot.
Yeah,
but
I know the fight you're talking about. The fighter ended up having a broken orbit, a number of lacerations, a broken nose. I mean, that was just unfortunately one of those examples of probably a fight that went on a little too long. It's always easy to play armchair quarterback, the day after I realized, but I think all of us can agree, looking back in retrospect, looking at combat sports specifically, there are instances where a fight probably could have and should have been stopped a little earlier.
So, what is your role when you? I know you were on the board for the Kentucky boxing, but day in day out, what's your role in that organization?
When I was on the commission and chairman of the medical advisory panel, essentially I was tasked with looking at all the fight physicals. Number one, to ensure that these were fighters that were safe, not only from a neurological standpoint, but just from a mental health standpoint, safe to get into the ring or the cage for competition. So there was that administrative type role, but then also there was the role being on the ground, fight night, actually providing, cage side or ringside coverage. And then thirdly, there was the responsibility of being there to evaluate fighters, between bouts to be sure that there were not, what you always worry about in combat sports, some of those more chronic issues that can accumulate over the arc of the career, and that's what you really want to try to get in front of, so that you're not setting those guys up for failure, years down the road. So it was really a confluence of a lot of things. And I really enjoyed my time on the commission. I'm not actively involved now, but I'm definitely still a strong combat sports fan.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. I mean, how does one get in to working, with concussions, and how did you get interested in being involved in that type of field?
No, it's a good question, and part of it was really just lucky, being in the right place at the right time. I always knew that I wanted to go into the brain field early on, early during my time in medical school. I realized that I really enjoyed it, and I really gravitated toward that quickly. And within the field of neurology, you can subspecialize into other specific areas. And I chose to go down the road of headache and facial pain. And this is where luck comes in. During my fellowship here in Houston, my mentor there, who was teaching me everything that I know now about headache and head trauma, also happened to be one of the team physicians for a number of the collegiate and even professional level sports teams in the Houston area. So over that year, I was lucky enough to be exposed a ton to concussion and concussion diagnosis and management. And that's where I really realized that I could pair my interests together, that being sports and neurology, and hopefully down the road be able to make a career of that. And I've been very lucky, very fortunate to be able to do just that. I love what I do, and every day is a pleasure.
Now let's talk about your practice. I know a couple years ago you moved into a new facility, which I unfortunately still haven't seen yet. I know I need to come to take a tour, but um, talk to us about what your practice looks like. What are the patients that you see? How do they get to you? And kind of your niche and location.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. This October, it'll be 3 years, believe it or not, that we've been in the new space. And it is a sports-specific neurologic practice. So about anymore about 85 to 90% of my patients are sport-related head trauma. The other, small percentage beyond that is just, regular primary headache disorders like migraine, primarily other types of headaches. So in our clinic, we have a specific area now where not only can you do the traditional like in an exam room evaluation, but we also have a larger, almost like a PT physical therapy like area that has a number of cardiovascular type machines, treadmill, stationary bike. We have a specially designed ping pong table, believe it or not, that can help with that vestibular ocular rehab, with to help with eye-hand coordination and eye-hand movement, which sounds hokey, but actually you can tell a lot just by watching someone with their eye-hand speed doing that. We have a head bag so that when I do see those fighters, I can still exert them in their sport-specific type exercise. So we've got a number of things designed on the floor where I can do an interactive exam or an interactive evaluation and watch them from a neurologic standpoint, but yet also do that while they are in a sport-like context to see how they do, not only at rest, but also as they start to exert themselves and start to do more sport-specific activity.
You had
Yeah, you
mentioned.
mentioned that.
Go,
Sorry, William, go ahead.
maybe we're on the same waveform here, but
We might
uh,
be. We might be.
so I was going to ask about I've been reading up a little bit, and they were talking about six types of concussions, six types of symptoms, I guess, and that would be vestibular, which would be the balance issues. Then I believe it's ocular. Is that how you say that, guys?
Right.
So that's your vision problems, mood and anxiety, migraine headaches, and cervical problems with the neck. So, um, I mean, when you see something like that happen out on the field, Andrew, maybe you can answer this as well because you're out there in the field and a lot of times, and you're right on top of it as soon as it happens. But maybe you can walk us through the baseline test that you guys do out on the field when somebody gets rocked out there.
I think sometimes people overcomplicate this. Um, I always tell young athletic trainers and other folks who I talk to about this, it's when you know the patient, it's actually fairly easy. At least what I've found. And Doc might not agree with everything I'm about to say, but when I know the patient, I can almost tell something's off. Um, at one point in time, there was a lot of concern about people lying that they had a concussion. Oh, I didn't have a concussion. No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. And playing off different symptoms and lying to the clinician. We don't really see that much anymore. I think if you build that rapport with athletes as an athletic trainer, you have that trust, and you build it over time. It doesn't happen day one, but that trust and respect is there. So the honesty I have found never to be a big problem. Now you mentioned baseline. At one point in time, we were baselining every single student athlete at the school, um, and we still in some ways do that, but in the immediate Lexington area, less physicians were using computerized testing to determine concussion diagnosing. So we kind of went away from that a little bit. But there are a lot of new technologies out there. Uh, One company that I've talked to recently called Sway, it just you use the iPhone app, you put it up against the chest, the student athletes do some balance tasks, and you get a baseline that way. Dr. Seifert might not know this, but I was involved with a study last year talking about ocular, William, where we were baselining all of our student athletes at multiple high schools in the Lexington area. And then if they sustain a concussion, we would check it again. But what we were looking at was their vision and how quickly they can respond to certain lights within the field of vision. So we were looking inside of a unit, and you saw a light kind of shine in multiple different directions, and you were supposed to focus on that. And the laser actually went to the back of your eye to see how fast and if you were able to concentrate on that dot.
Wow.
Essentially, the product was made originally for diagnosing lazy eye. And this company based out of Boston, it's really potentially a cool feature where you can quickly go into a privacy tent, take a quick ocular test. There's no lying as far as that goes. And that's one way that you can also do baselines. There's a lot of those potentials out there, but whatever you use, you need to be consistent, and you need to make sure you follow through with it.
Right.
You can't just say, I'm going to do these guidelines and kind of fudge it along the way. You do it, you stay consistent with it, you find what works for your school and your patient population, and you go with it. I've been fortunate enough that most of the different concussion guidelines I've made at the school, I've always sent to Dr. Seifert, hey, can you take a look at this? Let me know what you think. And it's always nice to have a medical professional like him to be able to check off that we're doing everything correct. Doc, you can maybe speak to more about that. You may not agree with everything I said, but
No, I agree wholeheartedly with everything you just said, and a number of great points that you just brought up there. First, on knowing the athlete, I think that is absolutely critical. And you hear a lot of people, if you think about the NFL, for example, there are a lot of critics out there that say that all medical personnel on the sideline of an NFL team should be, quote unquote, unaffiliated, meaning they don't have any tie to the team, they're not being paid by the team, they don't know these athletes, so they can be completely unbiased and objective. And, in a perfect world, that sounds great. But in practicality, when you show up on Sunday and you have somebody that comes off the sideline and you've never met that individual before, you have no frame of reference on how they usually are or how they usually act at their normal baseline. So, what sounded good in theory almost starts to add a little bit of a different wrinkle that's working against you. Um, so I agree wholeheartedly about, the better you can know the athletes at their normal self, at their normal baseline, the better. Yeah, and your question was a good one about different types of concussion, at least in how they present. And that's really something that that we've started to learn a lot more about, really just in the last 4 or 5 years. And rarely is it just one specific type. Rarely is it just, someone has a concussion-like migraine and that's it, and that's all they've got. Usually it's a components of a number of those, where it'll usually have one or two features that are a lot more prevalent than the others. But usually you see it all kind of intermixed together in a muddy mess, and then you start to decipher out, how much is this, how much is that, and that helps to guide treatment, which, treatment, again, 7, 8 years ago was limited. Treatment now is a lot better. And that comes back to my third point again, what Andrew just said. When we used to bring somebody off the sideline to evaluate them, it was strictly 100% a judgment call. But now we've started to get more and more data and more evidence on capabilities that provide us with that objective, evaluation, like looking at eye movements, like looking at eye movement speed, like looking at specific things on mounting. So, that clinical judgment is always going to go into making that call. But now we're also able to incorporate a number of very clear objective measures to help the decision a little easier.
Yeah. How is you talked a little bit about it there, Andrew, but how has technology evolved over the last, say, 5 years with concussions? And from my understanding, they're even starting to put smart devices in football helmets that can, I guess, send back data to you guys on the sidelines.
I think the biggest thing that technology is going to help with are the symptoms that are underlying that aren't immediately seen. Or, we're not going to be able to stop every concussion. I don't think technology is going to get to a point where we stop every concussion. But when are we able to safely return? I think we can definitely use technology to help us. But Doc brought up his facility there, and he talked about the different therapies that are there, the different, cardio units. I think it's important to understand that, again, we can't stop every concussion, but through research and technology and rehab skills, we can do a lot to help them post-recovery to, one, make sure when they do return, they return safely. And two, we do everything in our power to, instead of those symptoms going on for a long period of time, shrink them down. Now, again, we're never going to get to a net zero, but we can definitely help the patient return safely, quickly, and in correct medical guidance. Rehab is a big component of concussions. It's not just you get a concussion, you sit in a dark room and you rest. Those days are long gone. It might be good for the short term, but a lot of research is out there showing, look, activity is good, modified, medically, making sure there's medical guidance over that in a safe way. There's a lot of things you can do to help them along that process. And, Doc mentioned his facility. I'm sure he has a lot of patients there every day doing that.
Yeah.
No, he's right. The way we treat concussion now is night and day different, even than when I first started this, 10, 11 years ago. Because we used to approach things just like he had mentioned. If you got concussed, you were essentially shut down until your symptoms had either completely resolved or nearly completely resolved before we even started that return to play progression. Now it's almost the flip opposite of that, to where shortly, almost as soon as possible after the injuries occurred, we try to start to get athletes active again. Certainly not back in a contact-like setting, but yet we try to start to get the body moving. And I think both from a physical standpoint, because you're talking about disciplined athletes that are used to being active and doing something from a cardiovascular standpoint every day, and if you shut that down immediately and comprehensively, they don't respond well to that. But even the arguably more importantly, from a psychological standpoint, it allows the athlete to have something to buy into so that they can feel like they're being proactive in that recovery process, which I think is just as important as the physical component.
Yeah, I think Doc brings up a great example. A lot of the symptoms we treat post concussion aren't necessarily ones you think of all the time. We talk about depression, we talk about anxiety, sleep disorder. All those things come into play, and being able to treat every symptom the best way possible is very important. So you just sitting and resting a lot of times isn't the best thing for you. I know one thing we've done at LCA in the Lexington area is those folks dealing with concussions that are almost there, but they're not quite there. Maybe they are dealing with a little bit of anxiety or depression, or maybe they are dealing with that last little bit of headache we just can't get rid of. We very safely put them on a system called the Buffalo treadmill test, where we have them slowly guide into cardio exercise in a safe way. They're actually doing exercise, which they're athletes, they want to do that. We're increasing blood flow, which inherently has helped them. And you'd be shocked how quickly they respond to that. And that's just one example. There's a lot of other ways too. You mentioned vestibular earlier, William. If there's some vestibular issues, sometimes it doesn't take many treatments to fix that. But if you don't treat it, it can go on for a long time. So getting the appropriate medical care is very important.
Let's talk about ocular again, and specifically, if an athlete's concussed and, they want to try to get back to normal too soon, so they're out there, they're looking at bright lights on their cell phones, or they're wanting to play video games. What would you say to those athletes?
That's a good question. And again, that goes back to, thinking about how we used to approach things where, again, we would tell, student athletes or even professional level athletes after concussion to completely 100% stay off of screens for an extended period of time, electronic screens, that is. And again, like Andrew had mentioned, in the short term, that's still very helpful and something that generally I'll recommend for about 48 hours, more or less, sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter. But after that initial about 2-day window has passed, then you really want to start to try to reacclimate them to at least some exposure in a stepwise manner. Because what can happen, and I see this a lot where an athlete was concussed 3 months ago, and they walk into my office and they still have on sunglasses, and they're wearing sunglasses 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The brain responds to that, and sometimes not in a good way. If you or I were to walk around 7 days a week, 24 hours a day wearing sunglasses, eventually our brain is going to reach a point to where if we try to take those sunglasses off, everything is going to seem bright because the brain is kind of reset, that normal physiological threshold to a level that's not normal. So you don't want to overexpose after a head trauma, but you also don't want to falsely suppress that normal stimuli for any longer than you have to. So it's really a matter of stepwise progression, both from a physical activity standpoint, like we talked about, but also with things like cognitive exertion and screen time exposure. It's just a common sense approach to normal levels of activity, whether that's cognitive or physical.
Andrew?
Well, he brought up a good point, and I'll also kind of piggyback and say this. Everything he's saying, he and I kind of live every day in our world of sports medicine, but not everyone understands that. And I think when you sustain a concussion, I think it's extremely important to be diagnosed quickly, but also seek the best care you can quickly. Right. If you don't seek the best care quickly, or you seek care that might not have had the best guidance, and no fault of their own, I mean, we just see it a lot where it might not be their specialty, you get off on the wrong foot. So I think everything he's talking about is exactly true, but I'll also say that getting in and seeing that provider quickly who really knows concussions is going to be very vital for your outcome.
What do you see the biggest care in concussion care? The biggest need in concussion care right now being?
In my opinion, it's a couple different things. And one, again, is to segue out from what Andrew just mentioned. I heard somebody in the field say this once when I was first starting out in seeing and evaluating and treating concussion, somebody that I trust implicitly. And his point was this, rarely is the problem the concussion. Usually it's more so the mismanagement after the concussion. Either the care that they didn't get at all, the care that they got too late, or the care early on that was just not very smart. And again, through no fault of anyone. Some people just see this injury a lot more than others. Even as a neurologist, I wouldn't be a great Parkinson's doctor anymore just because it's been 15 years since I've seen Parkinson's disease on a regular basis. It's just not in my wheelhouse. And I think that concussion is a lot like that for some of these other clinicians. So that's one thing. And then secondly, I'm still living now in 2020 really concerned about the care that some of these student athletes don't have access to that are in more rural settings, either because they don't have a specialist close to them, or also just from a socioeconomic level, they don't have the means or the capability of travel to go see a concussion specialist, an hour or 2 hours away from their home. That's one of the rare silver linings that I think we have coming out of this COVID-19 crisis. Statewide, across the Commonwealth, and really across the country, I think one thing that COVID has done is helped to kickstart the telemedicine field, into some degree of normalcy that we just didn't have, 3 months ago. I know that my practice has changed tremendously over these last 3 months, just from being able to now be able to offer that telemedicine capability. And I can only speak for myself, but I know that in my practice, telemedicine is going to remain, is going to continue to have some presence going forward, even long after this pandemic is over. And that's where I hope that, not just from my standpoint again, but other concussion specialists are able to open their doors to a completely different population of student athletes that just didn't have that access prior.
I think I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask you about that. Your office is in Louisville, and I know that you have patients from across the state drive up there, but driving up there 5 or 6 times in a month or two is a lot different than driving up once and then telemedicine.
I think we might have lost. We might have lost Andrew there for a second.
Yep. I think there we go. Well, anyways, I'm just glad you brought the telemedicine up because I think that's definitely going to be a big game changer for the care of the rural Kentucky student athlete.
Yeah, I sure hope so too. I have high hopes for it.
Yeah, telemedicine. We've heard quite a bit about that. Not only on TV. Them talking about it, hyping it up, but when you actually see it, examples of it in the workplace and how it's really changed the in-person visit during this time. It's really changed, been a game changer for you guys. I would imagine.
Absolutely, and we're going to continue.
Yeah. So what about, some of the side effects of the concussion after, and we're talking about post-concussion here. Again, when an athlete or just anybody is trying to get back to normal, have you heard any cases of declines in grades or, continued vision problems or things like that?
All the above would be the answer to that, at least clinical experience. And, I got into the concussion niche from the world of from from the direction of headache. So that always is a big thing that I look for early on, because that's just the way I was trained. And I believe this also, that in someone that presents after head trauma where their primary complaint is headache, if you can aggressively and effectively treat the headache issues, more often than not, what you'll see are those other symptoms, those other secondary symptoms will also start to fall in line. So that's why I tend to always err on trying to be a little more assertive in how I treat the headache. But back to your question, without question, you see the problems with short-term memory, with attentional deficits, with dizziness, with the extraocular, the eye movements, the visual focus, all of those things. And that's where, again, coming back to knowing an athlete and just listening to the athlete, the patient's going to tell you what they need if you'll just listen to them. The patient's always going to tell you, even if they're not coming out and telling you, I need this or I need that. If you listen to what they're telling you, if you pay attention to their symptoms, you can tell which direction treatment needs to go. It's not always a quick fix. That's the frustrating part about the injury. And again, I try to be very straightforward with my patients about that from the outset. That this injury could very potentially be a slow, frustrating recovery process. But having said that, it is a process of recovery, and one of which you can get through it with time.
Got some people in the chat chiming in here too, and they talk about Jessica wants to know about multiple concussions and when should you call it quits for the specific sport. If you get multiple concussions playing.
Yeah, I'll just say what she says in my angry treatment as well. But I get asked that a lot, especially during sports, the active sports season. And the honest answer is there's really no set number. There's somewhere this urban legend was created. I'm not sure where it came from. That if you get 3 concussions, you're done. You should hang it up. And that's not necessarily the case. I've seen student athletes that have had one, but yet it took them 18 months to recover. And that's someone that, even after a single injury, I'll try to steer them away from contact sport participation thereafter. But on the flip side of that, I see student athletes that have 4 or 5, but yet after every injury, their recovery was very short-lived. Within a matter of 3 to 4 days, they were back at baseline. They have no residual deficits whatsoever. They're able to tolerate all levels of physical activity without those symptoms coming back. And that's someone, obviously we'll continue to watch it very closely, but yet I'll generally still allow them to continue to play with a lot of counseling and close follow-up. So to answer your question, there's really no set number. It's different from person to person.
I think it's important to treat the patient, not the diagnosis. And Doc kind of said that without saying it. I'll share a story that I'll try not to divulge too much information on, obviously patient privacy, but I've had some patients that have had multiple concussions that really overall they're doing pretty well. But talking about knowing the patient, I know the family, I know some of the mental health that might be in the family. I had to make a really tough call years ago that I struggle with. I'll be honest with you. I really did not feel the athlete was ready. The athlete could play sports, but wanted to play a contact sport, and I said, I don't like this idea. He got released by his physician that had diagnosed the majority of his concussions, and I still said no. That doctor called me and ripped me a new one. Like, it was a very uncomfortable conversation. Lots of F-bombs, to be honest with you. But I held my ground. And the orthopedic team physician I was with, he backed me. The school board backed me. And at the end of the day, I still feel like we made the right call. I love the kid. He could still play sports. but it was the right call at that time. But Dr. Seifert mentioned that one concussion. I've had patients and student athletes that one concussion, that's all that needed to happen. And there's two in my 15 years at LCA that really had a hard time recovering from one. And we've had a fair amount of people that have those 2 or 3 minor concussions through their time in high school sports that really, they're out for a little bit and they're back at it pretty quickly and they're back at it safely. You don't want to use the word minor concussion. I'm sorry I use that, but every patient's a little different.
Yeah, there's a level system. Is that right on how serious the concussion is? Is that still hold true?
Yeah, we kind of gotten away from that. They used to grade concussions back, 15, 20 years ago, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. Really, it's concussion anymore. We try to stay away, just like Andrew just said, about specific labels. You'll still, even now, I'll see a note from a ER physician somewhere or another physician in some other location that's labeled it with some sort of specific grade. But, for example, the reason why it's tough to do that, if I see somebody 2 days after their injury, and what looks to be, for all practical purposes at that point in time, a pretty severe injury, they're really symptomatic, they're really still struggling, but again, it's only 48 hours in, and then I see them back a week later, and they're tremendously better. Is that a severe concussion, or is that a mild concussion? Is it a middle of the road? Or if I see somebody that looks, fairly good 48 hours in, but yet they're still struggling 2 to 3 months down the road, is that a severe concussion? Is it a mild concussion? So it's an ever evolving target, and that's why I think we've started to really kind of pull back on labeling or mislabeling from the beginning, because I think it can provide some sort of false sense of security, as well as false sense of fear as well in certain conditions.
Andrew, you being out in the field as well, I know like the high schools have really upped, and college as well. They got the concussion protocols now that we've seen over the last few years. Kind of get a little bit more serious on the sideline, to where if a player is down, they're going to take him to the sideline and make him sound out until the next play at least, or after he gets his evaluation done. How has that changed the way that you guys do work on the sidelines?
I think it's important to point out that you can't rush those decisions. If an athlete goes down, you need to do your evaluation. You see in the college sports, the privacy tents now. We have one at a couple of our schools in Georgetown, and they've been a great help being able to evaluate the individual without all these eyes and ears and people walking up and walking over. It's really good to be able to do that evaluation in a private setting. Oddly enough, the person that really pushed for that privacy tent was the football coach of that school. And once you do your evaluation, if you feel like that athlete checks out, yeah, we're safe to return. But if that athlete doesn't check out, they're going to the medical professional, they're going to the doctor, and they're not coming back until they're cleared and then finish their return to play, however long that would be. But yeah, I just encourage people not to rush those evaluations. You can't just do it in 2 seconds. You have to take your time. Even in the championship game.
Yeah. If I can interject on that as well, because Andrew just brought up another good point that sparked a comment. A lot of times people will have a misconception that on the sideline we're always either diagnosing yes, concussion, or diagnosing no, not concussion. When in a lot of the time, if not a majority of the time, there's a tremendous gray area where we're not really making a definitive call one way or the other, but we're essentially triaging. So we're taking all the information that we have available and really starting to apply levels of probability. Either this is absolutely not a concussion, or it's possible concussion, or it's a very high likelihood of concussion. But once you kind of tip the scales into even possible, that's when we're pulling them out of further contact risk, at least for the remainder of that day, until we can come back and follow up them, again with another examination in 12 to 24 hours and see how symptoms have evolved over time. Because that's a big thing that can happen with concussion is often it's not readily apparent, 5 minutes after the injury that they definitely have the injury. Sometimes it takes those first 12 to 24 hours for the symptoms to really take hold and declare themselves. So that's something I always try to stress is that it's often not as easy as a black and white yes and no, question to answer.
Right.
And
What?
Doc brings up a point I'll piggyback off too. We do see some concussions that maybe there was a hard hit, maybe no one saw it. Obviously there's only usually a couple medical providers at a high school game when there's 20 at a NFL game. Um, and maybe the patient really didn't fully comprehend, I think I'm okay. I'm okay. I don't need to tell anyone. I'm good. And then they continue to play. And I'm not as worried about that second hit, but that's definitely a worry of mine. But what I worry about is when you continue your physical activity, it's kind of like rubbing a blister. You're going to make it worse over that next period of time that you're playing that evening. So that next day, your symptoms are a heck of a lot worse. We do see that where they continue to stay active after their concussion, and because of that, I found that their symptoms are definitely worse than they were if we had pulled them, if we had known about it, or whatever the situation is.
Yeah. So Cynthia wants to know what sport or activity do you see the most coming in and out of your clinics, and of course, I guess for you on the sideline too, there, Andrew.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, well, I think if you remove football, women's soccer is definitely number one for me.
Oh wow.
Um, and oddly enough, we don't have a lot of female lacrosse in the general area, but that's also statistically very high. If you don't know the difference between women's lacrosse and men's lacrosse, it's very different. But one of the big differences is that there's no real contact in female versus male, but the females don't really wear helmets. They're coming out with some stuff now, but they don't wear helmets. If that ball is flying around and, sticks are potentially hit you too, but they don't have a helmet on. So that's a concern. But yeah, women's soccer for sure, if you take football out. But I would say there's some years that football is pretty good. It's women's soccer that's definitely number one. But that's number one, number two in what I've seen.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree. Football's the obvious one. Without question, females soccer is the number one. But then also, I would say high on the list would be wrestling, um, and believe it or not, cheerleading. I see cheerleaders all year long, all year long. Both the Flyers, I've had to learn a little bit about cheerleading in the last 10 years. The Flyers, the ones that are up in there doing all these crazy things, and then the bases, the ones that are on the ground catching the Flyers. But having said that, yeah, I'm never amazed anymore at the human being's ability to concuss themselves if you give them enough, rope to hang themselves. Probably one of the most interesting concussions I've seen was a cross country runner who was out on a run here in a little area through one of the local parks. Who was out early one morning just on a training run and had a deer that darted out in front of her on the path. She got startled. She tripped herself. She fell and hit her head. So
Wow.
She was concussed with cross country, which you would think would be hard to do, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you could get a concussion walking outside and bumping your head on a door or something, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you one crazy story, and I don't mind sharing this. This shows me why when lacrosse becomes a bigger sport, you really need to make sure you have multiple athletic trainers working at a high school. Um, we had a lacrosse game going on at the high school I was working at, and a baseball game. We had an athletic trainer at the lacrosse game, but it was a PRN kind of deal where they weren't usually at the school. They were called in just because of the multiple events going on. And there was a circumstance that happened at the lacrosse field that we had to call an ambulance. Thankfully, it wasn't terribly a huge deal, but still, it took some attention away from the baseball game, even with two athletic trainers, making sure gates are unlocked, make sure EMS got in there okay. It took some attention away. While I was away doing that, a baseball kid at bat, a ball came in, hit his head, and on the video, it just goes straight back to the pitcher. Wow. It's like taking a hammer and just going like that. A lot of times in baseball, you get hit, but a lot of times it kind of ricochets off, but this literally hit his head and went straight back to the pitcher. Now, I didn't see that, but I got to the field. He was at first base walking back towards the dugout for us to check out. And honestly, he checked out fine. And again, I didn't see the hit, mind you, but we talked through it, did all the testing. He checked out fine. He goes back to first base. No, I take that back. He didn't run, but he did go play the field the next inning. And the rest of the game, he had another hit. Defensively, he probably played his best game I've ever seen him play. But then after the game, and this is where that follow-up care is important, we had another conversation. And through the game, we were talking in the dugout. And at the end of the game, we were talking, and he's like, yeah, my head's starting to hurt a little bit. I'm like, okay, well, here's the deal. You were fine up until this point, but we got to watch this now. We got to take care of this. So I was talking to mom, talking to student athlete. We got all on the same page, and his headache got a lot worse. Went to the hospital that night and had a small bleed in the brain. Scary.
Oh, wow.
The next day, honestly, he felt okay. And as far as concussion symptoms go, he really did fine. But obviously, he was pulled out of the baseball for the rest of that season. Now, in that situation, if I had saw that, would I have done something different? I can't answer that, to be honest with you, because what we talked about, sideline evaluations, you take your time, you do your eval. If everything checks out, everything checks out. But you do continue that conversation through the evening, and that's the important take-home point on that. Student athlete did fine, no big deal, but the coaching staff, myself, and the parents were talking a month later about he had his best game of his life that day, that at least we've seen. But it's just one of those stories that I always remember, and yeah, so.
Yeah. And that's a good point, Andrew, about having the wherewithal to obtain that follow-up evaluation. Because that's something that I was taught early on, which I agree wholeheartedly with. Nobody is ever going to criticize you for doing a follow-up evaluation, whether it's later that day, later that game, or later the next day after the event had taken place. And the NFL, I think, is a good example of this. Over the years, the NFL's, rightfully so, to some degree, taken a lot of criticism for the whole concussion problem.
Oh,
also done a lot of things right. One of those is anytime a player is removed from the game in a professional football game now, and they have to undergo that sideline evacuation in the tent, even if they are fully cleared and return 100% to the game and do great, and they're not diagnosed with concussion, if that evaluation had to take place during the game, they are now mandated to have to go in the following day to get a follow-up evaluation, just to be sure that things still look okay. And 99% of the time they do, But I just think that's good, solid medical care to kind of, close the loop on that and to ensure that there are no issues that have evolved over those next few hours.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew, how did that feel, knowing that you did everything that you knew to do, that you've trained to do so hard, and being right, for him to go get that follow up and find out that he had the blood on, the bleeding of the brain there, and you kind of,
Well,
what would have happened if you didn't tell him that, if you didn't suggest
no,
you go get it seen?
I'm not going to take all the credit for that. I'll be honest. I think the conversation with the mom, myself, and the student athlete, this is where knowing people and having relationships is very important.
Yeah.
I had a lengthy relationship with that family, and that relationship continued, even after that day. And having that trust is important. Having that communication is important. And when you have those conversations of saying, look, you know, if this gets worse, if this headache, we got to go. You got to go. And mom's instinct was right that night. I think my son's getting worse. We're gonna heed the advice and go. Um, Now, again, in that situation, thankfully, really, when you talk about concussion symptoms, he really didn't. Even the next day, like he had a small headache maybe from that, but realistically, not a lot of concussion symptoms at all. Besides that, and he healed up just fine. And uh, but it's just a story I like to share that shows when lacrosse becomes a KHSA sport, you need to have two athletic trainers at the high school.
Yeah.
And we've at our clinic made steps for that. We have one, two, three schools with two athletic trainers. And for me, I have a heart for lacrosse, and I will say that if the school has lacrosse and we're covering that school, we're going to do all in our power to make sure you have two people because of that circumstance right there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, what else you guys would like to add here tonight that maybe we haven't talked about or touched on?
Well, first, I would just like to thank you again for allowing me to come on. This has been great. This is my pride and joy. I could talk about this for another 5 hours. But I guess the biggest thing that I would stress is, just with the unique situation that we're all in, but especially from a student athlete standpoint, um, I think, really stressing the need for them to go back and get that solid conditioning base underneath them again before they start to, evolve back into, especially contact sports. Because this is a situation that honestly we've never really been in before. And we don't know from a sports medicine standpoint what this prolonged time period of inactivity is going to translate into as far as risk of injury going forward over these next few months. So it's going to be interesting to watch. I think at the end of the day, these kids are going to do fine, but it's just something we're going to have to watch, with a little bit of a different perspective.
No, I absolutely agree. I think William and I have talked about that. When the KHSA comes out with their guidelines, I think it's going to be really important. It's not only going to be a safety as far as returning to make sure we're socially distancing adequately enough, but also a lot of these student athletes have been void of activity for a lengthy period of time. So when they come back, they need to be there has to be a slow progression back in. And um, you know, one of the fears I have, I'm not going to lie, and a lot of our athletic trainers, we met tonight at 6 o'clock with my staff, and we talk all the time about what's the fall going to look like injury wise, because that's a true fear that I have that they're not going to be prepared. So the folks on the sidelines, the coaches, the athletic trainers, the athletic directors, we need to understand that it has to be a slow progression back in, and we have to keep them safe, and we have to keep it fun. They need to play. They need to play safely.
Yeah, that's one of the hot topics right now too. I think is rushing back too soon. getting back, because I mean, a lot of folks, that if you talk to them, they want to go ahead and get the games playing immediately, but you can't do that because I mean, for example, the football guys out there, hitting and stuff like that. I mean, you can't really just start practice and go ahead and put on the pads and start hitting and everything. You have to take it slow, like you're saying, Andrew.
Mm-hmm.
And I would use baseball too, but baseball's not going to happen for the high school level anyway. But throwing, especially in baseball.
Yeah, and that actually, when we thought we'd get back to play a little baseball, that's one of the concerns we had for our pitchers, making sure when they do get back, they don't rush into pitching. It has to be a slow progression back in that way too.
Yeah. That's a hot topic in the NBA right now too. Is they're wanting to rent out Disney World basically and run a playoff type format down there, but all the athletes don't want to get back, and start playing immediately. They want to condition first to get back.
Yeah.
And they used the I guess the lockout season was that 2011 or 2015. I forget which year it was, but they had mentioned that and talked about that specifically because when that lockout ended and everybody came back, they started immediate playing games, and then they saw more injuries that year than any other year on record.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Yep, sure
Makes
does.
sense.
All right.
Well, thank you, William. Thanks for having us on. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
thank you, William.
Been fun, very educational. I've learned a lot tonight. I hope everybody else did too. I appreciate you guys, Andrew, Tad. Man, we were lucky tonight to have you, Tad. We appreciate you.
I appreciate that. I'm lucky with that. This is fantastic.
Yeah, and I've got one of your videos. I'm going to end on that note. Is we pulled one of your videos off of I guess the Norton Sports Health website. Is that okay to play?
Back on my head here.
Okay. Is it all right to play or no?
Okay.
All right, we'll play that real quick. Yeah, that's when you had some hair there. A little bit different look, but same guy, I promise you. All right, guys. Appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks, gents.
All right.
A concussion is truly a brain injury on the spectrum of severity. Concussions are mild traumatic brain injuries, and what happens in a concussion is the body is hit either on the head directly or to the torso, and that causes this sudden reverberation, this sudden movement of the brain inside the skull. And what happens after that sort of a sudden movement is, on the cellular level, the neurons, the cells inside the brain, are not functioning normally, but yet you typically don't see that dysfunction or that abnormality on any sort of regular scan. A concussion can occur from a hit to the body as well. Really any sort of injury or blow to the body or blow to the head, but not necessarily to the head, but any sort of hit to the body itself that causes this sudden movement of the head on the neck. Most concussions do occur from hits to the head, but not necessarily all of them.